All right, well, welcome to our next lesson as we continue to look at the third module in Earth Environmental Sciences, which is all about energy transformations. Our last lesson we were particularly looking at what is solar radiation and how does it transmit energy from the sun to Earth, and what happens when it interacts with our atmosphere and all the different chemicals in our Earth. Today, however, we're going to look particularly what happens when that energy from the sun starts to interact with living things. What do living things do with that energy, and how they transform that energy to something they can use and pass it on up the food chain and all those sorts of things. But yes, so today, still looking at solar radiation and how that gives us energy, but particularly focusing on our life and how it's vital for life. So just to reorient yourselves, we're still looking at that inquiry question, which is how does energy drive the Earth's processes? So particularly the biosphere, all the living things is what we're going to be looking at in the next little while. Okay, and this is just the second half of that learning objective we had from last lesson. So instead of looking at how does energy from the sun affect the water cycle, which is as important, has implications for life, we're just going to be focusing more on photosynthesis, the interaction between light, life, and photosynthesis today. Okay, so let's get going. All right, let's get cracking. All right, so just before we jump straight into it, I thought it'd be a good chance to just recap or recall what solar radiation is. So remember from our previous lesson, solar radiation is a form of electromagnetic radiation which is emitted from the sun, and largely the amount of electromagnetic radiation that we receive from the sun is in three different bands. That is the UV or ultraviolet light, or the visible light spectrum, which is the most of the light that we see, if not all of it, depends how blind we are, and then finally the infrared or near infrared range. Okay, and this last type of wavelength is where we get most of our heat from, or radiant heat. Okay, so that shouldn't be too much of a surprise to you by now what solar radiation is, because we've already gone over it. So in terms of the effect of solar radiation on living things, we really need to focus on this process called photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis, which hopefully isn't a new term for you, is the process where living things, whether that's algae, vascular plants, non-vascular plants, anything that can photosynthesize, it's a process by where they take inorganic products like minerals in the soil and light from the sun, and they convert that into chemical energy which they can later use or store to undertake biological functions like growth and repair. Now, it's important to realize at this stage that this process isn't 100% efficient. Firstly, we've got to remember that the light itself coming in the atmosphere gets absorbed, filtered out, and not everything that enters the atmosphere reaches the plants or the photosynthetic organisms down on the Earth. So you'll recall from our previous lesson that of all the light that's entering our atmosphere, which is still only a small percentage of the light that's radiating from the sun, of that light, only 50% actually makes it to the surface where these living things are, or what we call the biosphere. And then of this 50% that actually makes it to the surface, really only half of that can be utilized by plants for some reason or another. Okay, so already the plants or the living things which produce all the energy for living, they're already missing out on a lot of energy, just simply by the physical nature of the atmosphere and how light interacts with other things. However, 25% of the incoming solar radiation is still a lot. Okay, and to maximize their efficiencies, a lot of different photosynthetic organisms, they use different pigments. Okay, pigments are like kind of the process or the organelle that helps the cells in these photosynthetic organisms to convert the light into chemical energy. Now, the 3 or 4 main types of pigments that you might find in photosynthetic organisms are chlorophyll A, which is primarily the most abundant, then chlorophyll B, carotenoids, and xanthophyllates. Okay, now these are the 4 main types. By all means, these aren't the only types. These are the main ones which we'll see, and they each have their own kind of unique characteristics which allow them to function better at different wave frequencies. So this might be helpful, for example, if you're a species of seaweed that lives close to the surface of the water. You might only need a certain type of pigment which is good at capturing, the really short wavelengths. Whereas if you're living deeper down in the ocean, you might want to have a different sort of pigment like the carotenoids, which are better at absorbing and converting long wavelength frequencies. Okay, so this is just some background information, not necessary for you to really understand this, because this is more a biology topic, but it's good to know that pigments are involved in converting the solar energy into chemical energy for plants. Again, this chemical equation for photosynthesis shouldn't be at all new to you. You should have seen it right through your science lessons right beginning in year 7 or 8. But just to recap, the photosynthetic equation is where we have, on the reactant side, we have carbon dioxide and water being rearranged by the light and the pigments in the chlorophyll, or the chlorophyll in the chloroplast, to produce glucose and oxygen. Now, it's fortunate for us that it does produce oxygen as a byproduct, because we wouldn't be here, and I'll talk a bit more about that later, but I think you can probably see where I'm going in terms of the fact that we breathe oxygen. But there's more, even more impressive things that oxygen does for us, other than just providing energy for respiration. And then that's, for those of you who might want to go a bit further, not just writing out the word equation, you can write out the symbolic equation too. Sorry. All right. So most people think of a diagram like this when they think of photosynthesis, because sometimes it's helpful to understand whereabouts these different processes are occurring. So in plants, the minerals in the water are being uptaken by the roots. Okay, there's no surprises there. And secondly, the gases such as carbon dioxide coming in and the oxygen going out, they all go through these specialized cells in the underside of the leaf called stomata. Now, they open and close depending on the temperature, or the outside temperature. We won't talk too much about that, but that's just an adaptation to make sure that it doesn't lose a lot of water through transpiration. But you'll notice already that the products or the reactants that the plant needs to produce glucose are coming from different parts of the plant. Okay, so they need to be able to transport these nutrients to the chlorophyll, which is inside the chloroplasts, inside the green leaves. Okay, and here we have just a close-up of a particular type of cell that has jam-packed full of chloroplasts. Okay, these green little bundles, packets of joy for the plant. Now, if we wanted to break down this process of photosynthesis even further, which sometimes as scientists we like to do, but we could break it down as these 2 different stages. That is the light-dependent stage and the light-independent or dark stage. Now, the light-dependent stage is a process where the light is initially captured and stored inside the cell, and it's used to break apart the water molecule, so the H2O, to produce oxygen as the byproduct and free-floating hydrogen ions. Okay, now anyone who does chemistry knows that hydrogen ions are quite reactive, so they won't stay like that for long, which is good because the plant wants to use those hydrogen ions to build glucose. And this is where the non-light dependent stage of photosynthesis comes in. Once these hydrogen ions are floating around, wanting to combine to something, the plant then uses the carbon dioxide and breaks that apart too to form glucose. Okay, so rearranges the chemical bonding there. Okay, and then it later either use that glucose for energy later on, combined with nutrients to grow and reproduce, or it stores it away somewhere for later. Okay. Now this is no mean feat. It is. Photosynthesis is quite a remarkable chemical invention, and really, without it, we wouldn't be here today. But the first photosynthetic organisms were really tiny, small bacteria called cyanobacteria. We can still find them, many different species, largely in aquatic environments in the ocean. But back in the day, that is when I say, I think 3.5 to 2.7 billion years ago, when they first started or achieved this feat, they were just in a completely different environment. So it wouldn't have looked anything like the world we see today. So there wouldn't have been any other life really, and any life that was around would have been restricted to micro bacteria in the oceans. Okay, so these guys here are the reason for our existence, in a way. Okay, so another important thing I was alluding to before, in terms of how oxygen has just radically changed life as we know it, not only because it helps us, undertake cellular respiration, but because it had two other dramatic effects. The first is that before cyanobacteria started photosynthesizing, there wasn't a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. And this enabled anaerobic bacteria, that is bacteria which don't really like oxygen, and they don't need oxygen to undertake respiration. Now, they were quite abundant before these aerobic bacteria, like cyanobacteria, came in. So as soon as oxygen started being emitted as a byproduct by all these microorganisms, the anaerobic bacteria, they started to decline and go extinct. Okay. The next big thing that oxygen producing organisms like cyanobacteria did was they started to form, or they indirectly formed, the ozone layer. Now the ozone layer, as you might well appreciate, is an important layer because it prevents a lot of the ultraviolet or harmful UV light from reaching the Earth's surface, which is very detrimental, particularly for organisms that wanted to live out of the water, such as us or any other terrestrial plants or animals. So it paved the way. So these cyanobacteria and their copious amounts of oxygen that they were releasing into the atmosphere, they paved the way for other more advanced organisms to not only evolve in the ocean, but to eventually come out on land and be protected from ultraviolet light. Now, today we know that there's lots of different types of organisms or plants that photosynthesize, and just to name a few, is like bacteria, algae, both micro and macro, non-vascular plants like moss and liverworts, as well as vascular plants, that is plants that just have a more complicated way of transporting their minerals and water, and these include ferns, trees and flowers. Now, it should be noted that when we're talking in terms of ecology, when we're talking about plants that can produce their own energy, like using photosynthesis, we refer to them as autotrophs, whereas those that rely on other primary producers, they're referred to as heterotrophs. That is, they are completely reliant on other animals to produce the energy they need, and they need to consume those other animals, whether they be plants or other animals themselves. Alright, so before we finish today's lesson, we've got to start thinking about, well, alright, how does light, nutrients and water, how do they all interact to influence the distribution of photosynthetic organisms around the planet? And to do this, I thought, well, let's just focus on 4 different types of environments. So here we have, on the left, we have the deep ocean environment. So in this case, we have plenty of water. What's missing, in most cases, is nutrients and light. Okay, so there's not a lot of growth or photosynthetic organisms going to live down there. Okay, even though we've got lots of water. The next level up if you think about the shallow coral reef or shallow nearshore environment, we have not only usually lots of nutrients, lots of light, and lots of water. So it's not surprising that this environment, of all the environments, so shallow coastal marine environments, are the most biodiverse and have the greatest amounts of living things anywhere in the planet. Alright, so let's move on to land now. Here we have a typical rainforest, for example, where we have lots of moisture, lots of water, and generally lots of light as well, but potentially not as much light or water as we would have in the near coastal environment, or maybe more light depending on where you are on the compared to if you're under the canopy or above the canopy, that sort of thing. Then finally we have the more of a semi-arid environment where we have high amounts of light, low amounts of water, and low amounts of nutrients. Okay, so you can see all these three factors influence how plants and other autotrophs can photosynthesize. So again, it's not just the amount of solar radiation which influences the transfer of energy through living things or living ecosystems, but it's all these other factors as well. The first thing we want to think about when we're thinking about energy flowing through an ecosystem is that where does it come from and what stages does it get passed on to other organisms, and how much of that gets passed on. So the first thing to know is that, not surprisingly, it all starts with the primary producers, that is the autotrophs, the things that can photosynthesize, take that inorganic material and turn it into chemical material that can be used by living things. The important thing at this stage is to realize that this process is very inefficient in terms of how much energy is out there and how much energy gets converted into chemical energy. So for example, at the beginning stage, the prime producers are only able to utilize 1 to 2% of all that solar radiation and convert it into chemical energy. But even saying that, it's still enough to sustain the world's ecosystems. The next level, the next trophic level, I might say, are the herbivores, or the primary consumers. Now, herbivores eat plant matter, and they eat plant matter for the glucose that the plant has produced from photosynthesis. Okay? It's interesting, again with the inefficiencies, that every time we go up a trophic level, only 10% of the original chemical energy that's stored in the sugars is passed on to the next trophic level up. So this is why we have this pyramid structure. So as we go further up, higher up in the trophic level, we get less and less energy being able to be used by those animals. So therefore, we have lots of plants and animals. So we have lots of plants and autotrophs, but we don't have very many higher order trophic levels such as carnivores, because they need more and more, animals and plants to consume to be able to maintain their energy requirements. Alright, so that's the main things we want to understand about energy flowing through an ecosystem, is that firstly we have different trophic levels, and at each trophic level only 10% of the energy is passed on. And we should also just kind of make a note that there's also this fourth type, or fifth type depending on how big your food web is, type of consumers, and they're the decomposers. They're the ones like the bacteria and all your flies and all those other sorts of organisms that rely on rotting matter. They help recycle all the nutrients, just like Mufasa was telling Simba before. Yeah, so I already mentioned that. Alright, so that comes to the end of our lesson. So the take-home messages for today, is to understand that light provides all the energy we could possibly need for living things. Okay, it's the instigator, and it does this through the photosynthetic process. We should also kind of highlight that even though this is a great an innovative process by living organisms, it's still very inefficient. Okay, it doesn't capture anywhere near all the light that enters the atmosphere or the Earth, and then even then it doesn't do a very good job of converting that into chemical energy, but it still provides enough for us to survive. The chemical energy that these living things can produce in terms of sugar can be stored and used by other animals, and that's why we have complex ecosystems, as we were just talking about. And then finally, most of the energy which is captured in this way, that is through photosynthesis, eventually is released or as waste energy or like heat through the process of respiration. And that's the process where I was telling you about, as you go up the trophic levels, you're only getting 10% of that energy being utilized. All right, so that's the lesson for today. Next topic, what we'll be discussing is looking at how the role of gravity and heat in tectonic movements influences the transfer and creation of energy at the Earth's surface. All right, and we'll hope to see you then.